ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of speaking with the great Ali, who my dear friend Lorenzo put me in contact to. So, Lorenzo, if you're watching this, thank you so much, because I've had so much fun speaking with Ali, and I'm fascinated by the project that he is doing at the net, which is really interested in this question of meaning, meaning today, meaning in the world. But it's also, I think, very refined. I think it's very data-driven. I think it's very research-driven. I think it is philosophically informed, so it's interdisciplinary. It's not one of those studies that say, oh, philosophy is not going to do anything for you, but it also realizes that you have to have a full scope of the human experience and approach it holistically. And then the question becomes, what are the ways by which we can actually generate or live according to meaning? Because we can talk about meaning all day long and just be talking about words. So how does it transition to be a horizon according to which people live? So Ali, thank you for being here today. Just to start, could you tell people about yourself, your work, your interests, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much for having me, Daniel. And I really appreciate Lorenzo again for connecting us. So how I kind of got started in thinking about netproject.org. Netproject.org is the name of our nonprofit. We're trying to help people constructively explore and create healthier approaches to meaning in their lives for more fulfillment and for better well-being. So kind of my entry point into this, is this big question of meaning, right? I think it's something that oftentimes people have these existential crises or breakdowns about in one way or another. Sometimes that's, masquerading as something else. It might be masquerading as a quarter life crisis or a midlife crisis or, the loss of a loved one sometimes can trigger it as well, a loss of a job, right? And for me, it really kind of happened when I was early in college. I had this, deep existential crisis. And for those of you who maybe don't know, it's like very well documented in the literature that these existential crises correlate to feelings of emotional dissettlement, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. Generally not too great feelings, right? Not too great positive affects. So I kind of, fortunately for me, I was able to kind of get through this period of existential crisis. And after getting through that period for myself, I realized that I wasn't the only one who was kind of had this experience. And many people still were going through it, right? Many people were going through it for years or felt like, their whole lives, right? I would observe around me, people kind of have this casual turning back where they would, at any point in time, they would just say, oh, well, nothing matters really, right? And they would oftentimes say that before justifying some either self-destructive or not just self, but socially destructive course of action or belief, right? So to make a long story, hopefully a little bit less long, I basically that got me interested in kind of researching this question of not what is the meaning of life, but how does meaning affect your well-being? Because it seems very clear and obvious that meaning it's more than just this intellectual philosophical question. It has real world consequences in how well someone actually is doing and the outcomes of their mental health, their behavioral health, and anything else in their life, anything from who you decide to date and marry, where you decide to work, where you decide to live, how you decide to treat others, how you decide to treat yourself. All those things, all those components are informed, and many more components are informed by your perspectives on meaning. And that was my kind of entry point into lots of the research I started doing. I did a handful of research projects and eventually wrote my thesis on how meaning affects well-being. And that research was able to kind of help us form the intellectual backbone of kind of the work we're doing at netproject.org.
Well, that's excellent. I'm really interested in that point you just made on the idea of meaning as health. I think very often, and this might just be a quick question, do you think today that we have a tendency to think of meaning merely in kind of metaphysical, as a metaphysical construct and need to think of it in terms of health?
Yeah, I think, I don't even know if it's recently, right? Perhaps it is recently, but it certainly is kind of the way that most people seem to approach these questions of meaning, right? They approach it as like, oh, these are, really deep existential questions, and um, there seems to be like two prevailing camps. One camp that just seems eternally befuddled and, aghast at this question, right? Like, how do I approach meaning, and creates a lot of anxiety, right? And then I think this other camp, in both these camps, I think would be in the camp of like, you know, being having some sense of like incapacity to answer this question, right? So amongst the camp of like the incapacity to answer this question, there's these two subcamps. The former camp is the one that I had just mentioned, kind of being really troubled by the question. And I think the latter camp is the camp that would be like they're confronted with this question and they just think it's useless. And they're like, oh, I don't want to think about meaning. That's something that like I'll drive myself crazy for thinking about, right? And the kind of take that I take in my research is that you can't get away from thinking about meaning. Meaning is what drives all of your actions, whether you're consciously thinking about it or not. Sometimes most of the time, it's just a subconscious process. Why do you decide to have dinner with a friend? Why do you decide to do X thing or Y thing? A lot of the times, it's because you have some sort of expectation or hope that whatever action you're taking is going to lead to a meaningful outcome, more so than the other outcome that you're not taking.
That's a great answer. I'd be curious how you respond to this. I sometimes wonder if the phrase existential crisis is bad because it kind of others the experience of meaning, and it kind of makes it like, oh, they're just having an existential crisis. And it's interesting because if someone was sick, let's say they had a sore throat or someone had a flu or different things, we don't tend to go, oh, that's just a flu sickness or that's just a cold sickness. We tend to go, they're sick. And there's something about the category, and I would just be curious to your impression. I've wondered this, like, I sometimes wonder if the word existential is problematic simply because it's so others these experience into this kind of abstract realm. And it's like, oh, well, you wouldn't be having that if you didn't read existentialism. That's almost what it kind of suggests. Like, oh, well, if you just didn't worry about existential things, you wouldn't have an existential crisis. But we wouldn't go, oh, well, if you just didn't put yourself in a place where you didn't get a cold, then you wouldn't have a cold. You're like, okay, so you want me to be in a bubble or something like that?
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes, I just as your response, or don't have to, it's just, I do wonder if like the phrase existential crisis others these experiences in a very problematic way.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So it's a really interesting question. And I think there probably are very many instances where the phrase perhaps does other the experience, right? I think, there's lots of nuance even to the question, right? So for one facet, right, like we speak of this experience of like, oh, you read existential philosophy, and those are the people that have an existential crisis. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, where actually, no, those aren't the people that only have an existential crisis. Pretty much everyone at some point in time has some experience of an existential crisis, even though you might not call it that, right? You can think about, like many conventional crises that we think about, whether it's, that quarter life crisis, the midlife crisis, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a career, right? Plateauing. Lots of these things in some way, shape, or form cause someone to lose a central part of what gave them meaning, or creates confusion in how they're thinking about meaning. And even though this person might have never read Sartre or Camus, the effect is that they are having an existential crisis, but we just have modern day terminology to label it. And we're not understanding that these are really types of crises that are, reflective of a larger, broader experience, right? So I think, like going back to your original question, does the phrase existential crisis other this term, right? And I think, it seems like it does do that, but at the same time, I think um, to not call some of these things existential crises is
Right.
we already don't do that, and it's I think prevents us from actually addressing some of the core problems at hand, right? The core problems at hand being that like, the reason why you're struggling with these issues is because you're struggling to approach life or struggling with these ideas of what meaning is in your life in a healthy way. So perhaps philosophy could have some PR department that could call it something else. But absent that, I think if anything, there are probably more types of crises and dilemmas that should be classified as existential crises.
Sure. I think that's a wonderful answer. And it always seems to be trade-offs. These things are tricky. It's like, too, I mean, in all honesty, I sometimes worry that the phrase mental illness reifies Cartesianism, a mind-body split. That's not meant, and it's clear that mental illness is different from some physical illnesses. And yet at the same time, if we call it a mental illness, it can sound almost separate from the body. It can sound separate from things. Also, oh, it's just mental. It's all in your head, right? And obviously, this isn't what anybody means, but it's always that tricky thing with language. Like, I think I always come back to Susan Sontag's book on metaphors illness, where she talks about, like, once you start calling cancer a war, then when people hear that they have cancer, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to war, and it becomes discouraging, like metaphoric structures and things. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't use those metaphors. I'm not saying those things, but it's always this interesting problem with language, because it really strikes me when you talk about meaning as health. And the more we can think of it like that, because there's this long tradition of philosophy as pharmacist, as medicine, as kind of healing in different things. And it's interesting, because then you're like, oh, this is a matter of kind of health. You can't separate it from other health concerns because they all go together, because it affects your very motivation and organization in the world. I'd be curious if you have any response to any of that. Those are just live thoughts I'll have to be thinking about after this conversation.
For sure. I think, it's at this point, there still exists stigma against mental health in many communities and societies, but for a large part, at least in 21st century America, right, and much of the Western world, there has been a lot of progress made against destigmatizing mental health, right? And along with that, one of the common pieces of advice that's often given to people is like, oh, do something like exercise and eat well, right? And that's going to help your mental health. And I think those things are true, but I think, what oftentimes gets forgotten is that the inverse is also often true, right? That how and this goes to your point of like having this disconnect between mental health and your physical body, right? Where if you have a better approach to mental health, right, that's going to help you also be physically healthier, right? And that's one of the things that we're talking about at the Net Project in particular with regards to like your approach to meaning, right? If you have a better approach to meaning, our argument is that this is going to have an effect not just on your mental health, but also your physical health. And those two things aren't really like things that you can separate out, right? If your approach to meaning has you live your life in a particular way, which oftentimes meaning does have that effect, that's going to have a very discernible impact on your physical health, right? And a discernible effect on if you're depressed or not, or whether you're anxious or not, right? It's not the only thing that's going to affect it, but there is, to say that's not going to have an effect, I think is being a little bit myopic.
I think it's an excellent answer. It makes me think of it's fall here on the farm, and sometimes you'll have in the evening these gradients where the sun goes down and it has this bright yellow, orange, blue, and it kind of fades from one to the other in the colors. And it's almost like often these matters are like a gradient, where there is a difference between the color yellow and the color blue, but they kind of blend into one another. And it's almost like we have to always keep in mind that when we use these terms, like mental health or physical health or existentialism, it's like, yes, we're designating distinction, but they're also part of a gradient where the colors kind of blend together. And there's just something about the human mind that really struggles with this. The mind creates a term, and then that it exists in a vacuum, independent of other factors. That's difficult to work through.
Yeah, I think it's just the way our brains kind of work. We're experts at, automatically classifying things and trying to pattern match wherever we can. So, we do it automatically, right? Like dogs look so different, right? There's so much variety with them, but our brain automatically registers over time, like, hey, this four-legged creature is a dog and that one is not, right? And then that practice doesn't only hold true for tangible concepts, it also holds true for abstract concepts.
I think that's exactly right. And you know, and I'd be curious what you think of this. One of the reasons why I think you're right. I think the term, you know, I'm not ready to never use the phrase existential crisis again. But one of the reasons why I sometimes existentialism has such a tradition of being linked with individualism, like a lone individual. And I think what your project points out, and I think it's correct, is that that existential crises that we see are evidence of a structural issue, something that's more structural. And the problem, not again, I'm not saying I'm never going to use existent in language always had, but one of the things I sometimes wonder is if the phrase existential crisis individualizes it too much, where then what we need to do is just focus on individual change and not think about, I don't know, it's tricky because there are differences between, say, system, culture, locale, there are these different levels. But it seems to me, and please respond with no if it's not the case, but it seems to me that your project points out an awareness of something that's more cultural and systematic that is leading to these existential crises that we can't simply locate it on an individual level. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, first of all, right? And if you take a look at some of the most prominent existentialist philosophers, right? People like Sartre, people like Camus, there's very much this, particularly with Sartre, right? There's this emphasis of individual freedom, right? And the capacity and the necessity for someone to make their own individual choices and to decide for themselves what is meaningful, right? And I think Sartre has a very almost empowering view sometimes, right? And especially in the backdrop of you're talking about like Sartre and some of these other existentialists talking about how for often in human history, the ways we've thought about meaning have been very conformist, right? They haven't been very individual focused of like, hey, what do you as an individual actually want with your existential freedom, right? And the kind of consequence of that, though, is for much of there's a few consequences to that, right? If you look at the consequence within the psychotherapy literature, right? So most psychotherapy literature doesn't really talk too much about meaning. Even the lots of the psychotherapy literature that does talk about meaning still emphasizes this point of meaning is something that an individual has to decide. Talk about meaning, we still use that conception, right? We think of meaning, what gives someone meaning, what someone's purpose is. This is kind of this, if we use those terms explicitly, at least, we say that these are things that you need to figure out for yourself, right? What gives you meaning and purpose and what your calling is, and use that language in that way, right? But to your point about the systems and the culture and the structure, that's 100% true. And I fully believe that to be accurate, right? And I think this is kind of the shortfall of placing too much of an individualistic view on existentialism, right? Because if you abstract away from, the existential terminology of meaning and purpose and the particular ways that's used, if you look at just everyday life, right? Meaning is created socially, right? People go to church, people go to mosque and synagogue and temple, and those are public spheres of creating meaning, right? People go to political rallies. Those are public spheres of creating meaning, right? Even beyond, you think of like those physical spaces, there's virtual spaces now that are cultural, almost like town halls where people create meaning socially with one another, whether it's a news feed, right? If you talk about everyone saying that, oh, did you see that tweet or hear that song or see that TikTok, or you have these different like social media trends, right? These things create culture, right? And they create subconsciously things that are mimetic, right? Things that you mimetically find meaningful as part of a shared culture. And I think the failing of existentialism, if any, one prominent failing of existentialism is the failure to recognize that meaning is such a socially constructed thing. And regardless of, how much you want to preach people to exercise their own existential responsibility and the freedom, you can't take away from the fact that we are social creatures. And there are a couple of reasons why we gravitate towards creating meaning socially. And I can go into that if you're interested.
I'm extremely interested, so I'll give you a lineup because I think this is really important. Let me give you one question first. I feel like a lot of people today are conflating meaning with self-actualization. I hear a lot of like self-actualization, like, oh, reaching your fullest potential and you'll find meaning. Have you had this experience? Do you have any thoughts on this? I feel like this notion of meaning is socially constructed. I'm not saying it's nowhere. I mean, there are obviously people who know about it, but it doesn't define the meaning conversation that you hear. Now, that's a broad term, and that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but we'll start with, do you think a lot of people think about meaning as self-actualization?
Sure. So I think this is, the way I'd answer this question is actually moving a little bit away from the social construction element aspect of meaning, right? But so if you take someone like Maslow, right? Maslow is one of the most popular 20th century psychologists. He's kind of all over in textbooks, anywhere from, the American high schools, and even abstracting at a higher levels away from that. This hierarchy of needs is referenced in like international aid literature, right? It dictates policy guidelines often, right? And it has such a pervasive grip on, this is what the hierarchy and order of needs look like. You first have your basic level needs at the bottom, and at the top, Maslow puts this self-actualization element of it. And what's interesting to consider, so Maslow never himself like had this pyramid of needs, right? He did have a hierarchy, right? And the hierarchy itself, so he puts self-actualization at the top. And I think that is kind of where people draw this connection of like, oh, meaning is a part of self-actualization. Self-actualization is that, this top of this hierarchy, right? And I think, there's an argument also against on like, is the hierarchy even real? Is there a hierarchy, right? Or is it a little bit more like gray and loose and squishy than this hierarchy, right? And there's some literature that kind of like points to that as well, that maybe it is a little bit more loose, but more, going back to your original question, right? Are people focused on self-actualization as a way to think about meaning, right? And I think if you look at the pervasive cultural grip that someone like Maslow and his hierarchy has, that is one element that maybe causes people to view self-actualization as equating to like what gives people meaning in life. You have to reach my highest potential. Now consider someone like Viktor Frankl, right? So Viktor Frankl, the also prominent psychologist of the 20th century, but unfortunately gets forgotten amongst the ranks of people like Freud and Maslow. And Frankl talks about you can't actually achieve self-actualization. What Frankl says is that the way you achieve self-actualization is through self-transcendence. And what he means by self-transcendence is giving yourself to a purpose or a cause greater than yourself. And Frankl says that by doing this, by trying to aim at self-transcendence, that's how you get at self-actualization. You can't aim at self-actualization directly because then you'll never get it. And in my own opinion and in my work, I think that Frankl has a very strong point and a compelling case. And I think if you think about even meaning, right, I think it's those like self-transcendent elements of meaning that oftentimes give someone a better sense of purpose, right, as opposed to the self-actualization elements of it. I think the self-actualization elements are very geared towards ideas like stoicism, right? I think that also reinforces self-actualization. And self-actualization, I think, these are, in stoicism, these are good ideas. They're not bad ideas. They're just not, I think, like the most healthy, productive, and constructive way to think about meaning. They might be useful ways for helping you achieve that meaning, right? If you think of self-actualization serve in this way of trying to pursue excellence, right? I think that is a very productive way of thinking about self-actualization. But in terms of excellence towards what, that's when you kind of need this question of self-transcendence.
That was a magnificent answer. And first, I appreciate you walking through and being so well acquainted with the literature, Maslow, and et cetera, so forth. That was magnificent. I also really like that you brought us to the place of this distinction between self-actualization and self-transcendence, because I think this is extremely important and ties back to the social question. A lot of people, self-actualization, and this also speaks to the trickiness of language. The phrase self-actualization makes it sound like you have everything you need. You just need to actualize it. But the language of self-transcendence means that you need to somehow go beyond yourself, which
Right.
puts at its core some kind of paradox. And what's very strange is if meaning is found in some sort of social relation, I'll just be general right now, that is kind of paradoxical in the sense that you actualize yourself by transcending yourself. What's going on? It's very strange. And yet, if this is true, this means we would need to turn to resources that are beyond an individualistic frame. And it makes me think, like, I think at this stage in the game on these kind of matters, I always really like C.S. Lewis has this lovely principle. It's called the first things first principle, and I use it all the time because I find it so useful. He says if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. And I think that's actually what we see here. If you put self-actualization ahead of self-transcendence, you get neither. But if you can put self-transcendence ahead of self-actualization, you get both. So the order is a really, really big deal. And I think that's where the research comes in on the question of what do we see? Do we see that when we prioritize self-actualization, you actually get the effects of meaning or not? Because if indeed what humans need is some sort of self-transcendence, and then from that almost kind of trickle down, although that's a difficult, economic phrase to use, but if you grant it here, there's then a self-actualization in that transcendence. Well, then the question of meaning has to kind of focus on that. And to speak personally, one of the reasons why I guess I moved, like I found kind of a dissatisfaction with some of the existentialist philosophers is precisely because meaning was so individually located. Now, there's truth to it, of course. There's something moving about the notion of Sartre that even if you're a prisoner, you can still be free because you're free in your mind, the gaze and being in nothingness. We can talk about Kierkegaard, et cetera, et cetera. But I moved into more of the philosophical sociologists, or the sociologists like Peter Berger and Philip Reeve, because all of them were warning that, hey, meaning is not individually constituted. It is found within social capital. It is found within the givenness of a community of other people in which you can situate yourself. And what to me is so problematic is in my opinion, that entire, I call them kind of the philosophical sociologists or the tragic sociologists. We all have our different terms. They're really not, in my opinion, spoken about very much. And they're an entire form of thinking about meaning as socially constructed and something that we have to think about. And what they warn is that the loss of meaning corresponds with the inability of people to find intelligibility in their communities. And the other thing, and then I'll give it back to you because I'd be curious what the research shows on this idea of social constitution that these people are pointing at. You mentioned excellence. One of the things that someone like, well, you could even say Pierre in his book, Distinction, he makes the point that you can be as excellent and authentic as you want, but if you're not in a community of people who understand your excellence, well, then it's not going to give you any sort of fittedness and it's going to seem empty. So, for example, if you're a world expert on Shakespeare, well, you kind of have to be around other people who know Shakespeare for them to recognize your excellence. Otherwise, it feels kind of empty and meaningless, or can lead to a kind of atomization or a certain backlash, like lash against your community. And so for existential, in order to kind of find meaning, and I think I remember you mentioned with Nietzsche, in Nietzsche, there's this idea that we deal with the loss of meaning aesthetically. Well, but that's still a kind of individualistic existential response to the problem of meaning. And it seems like it can work for some people, but then that's not really addressing systematically. Then at that point, it's kind of random. It's kind of scattered, right? And the idea of having to have a community of people that can recognize various existential responses often seems to be a kind of missing piece in the conversation. Now, I said a whole lot right there. You can disagree with any of it. I'd be curious what your thoughts on it, what your thoughts are on that, or research, or so on and so forth.
Yeah, excellent. Points there. There are a lot of things I can respond to, right? So, I think we can start with this. You with the Shakespeare analogy, right? I think that one is kind of a beautiful way that you put it, right? And So what is it exactly when I talk about like meaning being socially constructed, right? It's kind of similar to this experience that she described, that um, if you consider someone, who is maybe like a very religious person in a city where like no one is religious, or vice versa, right? Someone who is extremely irreligious, right, in a community that is very ardently religious, right? It can consider the same thing with politics, right, or just being intellectual, right, the way maybe your Shakespeare person is. And the experience of that person, right, when you have a belief system or any sorts of like belief that you hold in extreme regard as being very meaningful to you, but no one else around you recognizes or has an appreciation for that sort of meaning that you find incredibly important, it is going to feel isolating, right? It's going to feel like you're being ostracized whenever you do talk about this thing that's incredibly important to you, right? Even if you don't talk about this thing that's incredibly important to you by virtue of, the opposite thing being very important to the people around you, you'll feel ostracized that you have nothing in relation to the people around you, right? So in kind of dealing with that isolation, usually there are two prominent options that emerge, right? If you want to do something about it, at least, if you and you don't want to just let things go the way they are, you either move to a different locality where your beliefs are more in line with those around you, or you conform and adjust your beliefs to be more in line with the people around you, right? And so those are, two ways. That's one way in which meaning is socially constructed, right? This element of like um, conformity with the people around you, right? Either you conform yourself or you shape your surroundings so that your surroundings conform with your beliefs, right? The other element of why meaning is often socially constructed is that these questions are often very difficult to think about in isolation, right? So Sartre and Camus, you can talk about the romantic ideal of thinking about meaning for yourself and this existential responsibility, right? But even Sartre himself has this quote that man is condemned to be free because the freedom is what causes this existential anguish and anxiety for people, like this ultimate freedom of having to decide what meaning do you give your life and having to decide that for yourself, right? And because it's so darn difficult to figure out, we oftentimes turn to, okay, what are the social, cultural ways in which people are already thinking about meaning, right? Is there something there that I can latch onto or learn from, right? You're not going to use those terms explicitly most of the time, right? But it looks simple as like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, right? Like Joe who lives next door, or my friend, like down the street, or whoever is the cultural capital on social media or TV or the internet, right? Um, they have some ways to think about meaning and living their lives that I can replicate in some capacity, right? I can try and embody and I can try to learn, right? And that in itself can be a way for me to think about meaning, right? And this gets even more uh devious if you think it once if people latch onto something that's really difficult and non-replicable, right? And this is kind of how different things like parasocial relationships form, or like having some obsessiveness with a certain celebrity or culture because you realize, oh, you can't actually be like that singer or that football player, right? Not 100%, but your identity still warps around then this other person. And identity is a huge part of what gives people meaning as well, right? Um, and some other elements that I'll touch on before passing it back to you really quickly. I'm not going to be able to remember all of the points that she kind of laid out, but so this element of Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche talks about his idea of the Übermensch and master and slave morality. And Nietzsche is kind of similar in this regard, where Nietzsche believed that you had to kind of like that man had to overcome themselves, like men and women had to overcome themselves to reach this level of something greater, to actually to conquer nihilism, right? He talks about how people shouldn't turn to religion to kind of accomplish this, but they should turn to this idea of their own like uh, their own superiority and their own conquering of their challenges and their fears, right? And those again are really, I think can be for many people very empowering ideas. But the problem precisely lies again of like if your analogy of the poem, right? First things first, you have to have a reason for why you do that, right? If you don't have a reason for why you're doing that, beyond your own excellence, it's not going to get you very far. And we mentioned community, right? Community is a huge, reason why many people do this, right? For something or for people greater than themselves, right? Uh, it doesn't even just have to be other people necessarily. Oftentimes it can be a cause, right? Now it'd be great if that cause is linked to the betterment of other people, right? Because your cause usually has to be linked to something. And if your cause is just linked again just to your own self, it's not going to get you very far.
Beautiful. I think that addressed everything I had to say. That was perfect. And we all have to language things differently. And one of the ways I've languaged this problem is that humans need both meaning and belonging. If you have an individual meaning, but you don't feel like you belong, then your meaning gradually becomes empty or can't situate you or it's not recognized. But if you belong and you don't have meaning in that belonging, then you can feel oppressed by your social environment. And, I think a lot of the existentialism may have been so individualistic is because it's responding to the mass movement of the 20th century. Hannah Arendt talks about the banality of evil and how there is a kind of you belong, but you're not individuated enough to resist being manipulated and controlled.
Right.
And so that leads to all sorts of unintentional consequences. But now we have the unintended consequence of, we don't have to worry about mass movement so much. But, we're atomized and individuated to the point where we can't have communal recognition or communal fittedness. And so now the question is, okay, how do we go back to having some sort of fittedness in a social order without becoming a mass movement while maintaining the resources to differentiate ourselves if that community begins to become a mass movement or something like that? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
All right. I'm really glad you brought up Hannah Arendt and banality of evil. I think it's an excellent example of, the backdrop of the 20th century, right, where lots of these existentialists are working in, where mass movements have often and did often lead to this, banality of evil, oftentimes represented in nationalism and fascism, and really movements that cause a lot of pain and suffering for people, right? And the obvious antidote to that seems to be this idea of like, okay, if the mass movements are bad, then we focus on telling people like pursue what your individual meaning is for yourself and do that, right? And like, how do you balance the two, right? Because there's clearly you don't want the atomization, and clearly you don't want the, like blind allegiance to whoever kind of comes across, right? Not just a politician, but even like a celebrity, right? Oftentimes those two can be the same thing. So and the challenge is like, okay, how do you do that? How do you navigate that line, right? And it's an extremely challenging situation, right? The pessimist in me would say that you can't ever completely navigate, right? There's going to maybe be people who, no matter how much you encourage them to kind of individuate, they'll be swept up into mass movements, right? And it might not have anything to do with like, oh, they're not intelligent or anything. They might be very intelligent people, right? The idea with mass movements is just that mass movements can be incredibly compelling, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the virtuous or productive thing to partake in, right? So the element of that, right, is that like, okay, maybe one element is you create a mass movement that is more encouraging to and speaks to our better nature, right? That's one possibility, and that's the possibility that addresses like, okay, like you won't ever completely be able to get away from mass movements. On the flip side is that I think you still want to encourage individuality, in the sense that you encourage people to authentically decide like what is in their best interest, and that what their best interest is should align with this like broader societal well-being, right? and you can pursue that in an individual way too. So if you think about this idea of authenticity and how to accomplish that, so Heidegger has his idea of this idea of authenticity as being kind of a way to think about the lack of concreteness of meaning. He talks about death awareness being an incredibly powerful thing. Amongst the existential psychotherapists, people like Irvin Yalom oftentimes also cite Heidegger and talking about death awareness being the thing. I think there's a quote that goes along the lines of like, the physicality of death destroys you, but the realization of death liberates you, or something along the lines of that. I'm probably misquoting the words there, but it's an interesting idea, right? And the idea that Yalom and Heidegger talk about here is that being aware of your own mortality gives you the existential freedom and the wiggle room to realize that your life is too short for conformity and for not doing the things that authentically speak to you, right? And the like second order, effect of that, the hope of that is at least that not only is life too short to not live authentically, but life is also too short to not realize the true value that exists in contributing to society and to contribute to the world in some way. And that is how you kind of, as Frankl talked about, achieve self-transcendence. Now, my own personal opinion on this idea of death awareness, I think there's a lot of truth to it, but I think there isn't necessarily. I don't think death awareness is the totality of the answer. I think there's something more there, and I'm still working through like what I think that is. I am working on some papers and such that, some early thoughts on that, but those are some ideas for maybe how you walk that line.
I think again, your ability to review the landscape of thinking is very impressive. And I think you meant on Heidegger, what is very important is that although it seems very beneficial to realize that you have a limit, that you're finite, death does not tell you what it means. We have to decide what it means that we're finite, or how we're going to use that finitude. And at least death as a focus says, hey, even if you don't think you need to engage in self-transcendence, well, the world is transcendent of you, because after you die, it's going to keep going. So it's kind of a reminder of that, to be open to the otherness, to not be too much of a Hegel geek. But I always, every quote, have to make at least one Hegel reference. In the phenomenology, there's this movement from self-consciousness to reason. And the key characteristic of that is that in self-consciousness, it's I as I, self-relating. In reason, to begin true thinking, which for Hegel is reason, you must say I and other. As in, there's an external world that is just as real as you, and even if you can't access it the same way you can access your own consciousness, it is there. It is there. It's not solophilistic, or that term I can never use. And I loved also in your talk with Lorenzo on the idea that all that exists is my own consciousness tends to be something we see in like first world nations or white privilege or different things, because if your whole life is constituted by oppression, you don't ask if the world exists or not. It's a wonderful point. And Simone, you mentioned Du Bois, Second Sex, Charles W. Mills, Blackness Visible makes these points. I really like it. And for Hegel, like the movement to reason, of which basically he's telling you, you can't even engage in real thought unless you do this, requires an acknowledgement of the otherness, world, other person in general, having just as much reality as you. And I think that can be some of the use of the concept of death. But death alone will not tell you what now, right? You don't see, if we make an example of Christianity, yes, at the center of it is a cross, a symbol of execution, something akin to an electric chair, but then there's a lot more than just that, right? There has to be more to it. What I would say, I'd be curious how you respond to this. What it seems to me is that it's not enough to have meaning, you also have to be meaningful. And what I mean by that is other people have to see you as meaningful. Like if you say do a lot of painting, and another thing that I think is so important, that is a technical distinction you brought out, is the idea that a lot of people actually do have meaning. It's just that they're not able to realize it. Like they know what they want to do, they just can't actualize it. And then they start saying, what's the point? But it's not that they're, say, devoid of any sense of something they want to do. It's just that they don't have the time. David at Theory Underground will talk about time energy. They don't have the energy or time. They don't have the money. And since they can never actualize the thing that they want to do or that they find meaningful, it starts to become discouraging. I think it is important to make those kind of distinctions, because otherwise to talk about meaning sounds like people are just going around with no idea what they want to do, or they're devoid of any sense of direction, when really there can be structural problems that need to be addressed, perhaps, or thought through, or considered. But again, it seems like in addition to that, and you can reply to whatever you like, it seems like we need not just meaning, but we need to go into a community where we feel like we're meaningful in what we do to other people. Like if other people, like, in a term for that could be recognition. And it's not like a prideful recognition. You just want to be intelligible. Because if you're not intelligible, then you start going, well, is what I do meaningful? Because if no one else understands it, maybe it's not meaningful. And you start to wonder if you're self-deluded. Like you start to say, I thought it was meaningful, but maybe it isn't, because no one else seems to know what it means. And it starts to feel like you're self-deluded. I'm not sure if there's research or thoughts on all that, but I sometimes think that we have to not just think about meaningful, but meaning as also meaningful with that kind of social constitution or recognition.
And yeah, there's a whole lot there, to respond to. I'll see what I can do. But I think maybe with your last point first, this idea of, being meaningful. So maybe what I'm kind of understanding what you're saying at this idea is of what you're doing or your life, even to an extent, having a sense of value or worth to other people, right?
Yeah.
I think oftentimes when people talk about or think about like depression, right, especially suicidal depression, oftentimes the internal logic and thought process is that, what I do doesn't make a difference. Like it will, and I think you see this particularly with, kind of the suicidal ideation that happens amongst our youth, amongst teenagers, right? And I think so. It's a kind of nihilism, right? This kind of nihilism that what I do doesn't matter, and like I can't do something that does matter, right? And it can be this localized element of nihilism that like what I do doesn't matter to the people around me. It can also be this greater nihilism that like what I do isn't going to matter to the world and to the universe, right? So what's the point? And both of those two are troubling, and there's overlap amongst the two as well, and there's distinction amongst the two. And if you think about like there's interesting literature on the psychology just like helping people out, right? Of if you there's like so much literature on this where high schoolers or adults who even tutor younger students, right? Consistently you find that like the kids who do that end up reporting better mental health effects and better physical effects too, right? And if you think of what's going on in someone's mind, it's not too unreasonable to figure out this person now can see that, hey, my actions and what I'm doing have value and have worth. And it's the same like kind of funny anecdote of people telling if you're telling you if you're depressed, you should get a cat or you should get a dog, right? And be going to depend on you, and suddenly you'll have a reason to want to continue your life and do something. Now, I'm not suggesting to people like, hey, if you're depressed, out and or a dog, but that is, I think, oftentimes the logic behind kind of this like needing to feel like you matter to other people. Could you remind me what your other part of your question was?
Well, first, I think that was an excellent answer. I was talking about death limit as, it suggests that there's otherness, that there's a concrete world beyond you. So what you were saying, I think, aligns very nicely with that point. And I think it suggests, like, one of the things that religion does, that, because it seems like religion, as you were saying with Lorenzo, it has a critical component, is that there are, you could say God or spirits or angels or that are watching you, and it matters, and you have some sort of participation in a metaphysical tapestry other than yourself. But the main thing I was just saying is this role of recognition, which is hard to use that word because it sounds like pride or something. But it's like the question of meaning does not seem it can be divisible from social recognition, or maybe another way to put it is social intelligibility. Like, you have to be intelligible to the people around you and then see how they respond to their understanding of you. And you say, oh, I do make a difference because they respond that way. So generally just the question of social recognition and social intelligibility, which then I think speaks to social transcendence, because it's clear you are transcending yourself because there are others of whom are responding to you. Just all of that. A lot of times alienation in existential literature is very individualistic. It's like, God doesn't exist, the universe is going to die, what am I in it? When there's also this kind of social alienation that occurs that seems to be more of what makes people go into this kind of like, what's the point? What's the point? But then, of course, we have to balance all this with not falling into mass movements, and that seems to be the million-dollar question. But that's mostly like this recognition dimension to the question, I think really has to be taken very seriously.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot there, and some of which we have spoken about, right? And I think you're spot on with this element of the tragedy and difficulty of thinking about meaning as something that can be both individual, but not just individual, but also social, right? And how do you balance those two things together, right? So, and this idea also of like aloneness, right? There's this interesting phenomenon where if you kind of observe religious trends over time, right? This is more anecdotal, at least on my part. I haven't looked, or I can't remember the actual statistical research off the top of my head, but the anecdotal evidence suggests that people tend to turn to religion as they get older, right? And oftentimes, if you kind of ask people like, oh, what's going on? Like why, you used to be very like not very against, religion, or maybe not super interested in religion, and, what's driving you towards turning back to it. And oftentimes the kind of like framing of it is that there's some type of aloneness or loneliness that the individual is struggling to confront by themselves, right? Kurt Vonnegut has a really good quote. It goes something along the lines of, every time I see a person turning to religion, I think there's someone who couldn't stand being so goddamn lonely anymore, right? And the interesting idea, right? Kurt Vonnegut he wasn't a quote unquote philosopher. He wasn't a quote unquote psychotherapist. At least by, like formal titles, I think, he could be perhaps that for a psychologist or a philosopher for the soul. But the idea he mentions that is kind of present in some of the literature as well. So Irvin Yalom, for instance, right? He talks about this idea of a rescuer phenomenon, right? Rescuer and individuation. And these are two often common types of ways that people try and deal with the sense of being alone, and the sense of like existential aloneness. And Yalom describes that like in the presence of this existential aloneness, people oftentimes turn to a sense of individuation that like, oh, I can kind of transcend, and I have a strong belief in myself, and this kind of that self-actualization belief by another name. Or they turn to this like rescuer phenomenon, right? And the rescuer phenomenon isn't always religion. Sometimes it can be like a romantic partner, right? Or it can be kind of a sense of community, that you can be rescued by something, right? And neither of these two are completely like perfect approaches to this question of how do you confront with your existential aloneness, right? Over time, you see more people going towards the kind of like rescuer lens of looking at things, especially as they age. And this kind of goes back to why do people maybe turn to religion as they get older, right? Your capacity for believing that you are truly special and invincible in light of the universe, right? Or in front of the universe starts to diminish when your body starts to give out and you start having ulcers and you start having different, like problems and aches and stuff. And maybe you're not so special anymore. Or you're at some point your career plateaus and you can't keep up with the 19 and 20-year-olds coming out of college. And this this idea, of the specialness does tend to recede. And it's an incredibly challenging thing for anyone to kind of deal with this existential aloneness. And what Yalom gets at, and what some of the other existential psychotherapists and philosophers get at, is that you can't fully ever confront aloneness in the existential way. It's something that you, instead of confronting, you have to learn how to accept it, and you have to learn how to incorporate it and understand that this is a part of your daily experience. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't have meaningful relationships and worthwhile relationships with other people, but you should lose the illusion that relationships with other people or within other people or broader mass movements, you will be able to find a true antidote to this aloneness. You might be able to find panaceas or things that feel like they're treating this aloneness, but it never truly goes away. You just have the illusion that it's going away. And eventually that illusion may come tumbling down. Or it might seep into cognitive dissonance and other places of your life.
Excellent. One of the things that I sometimes think that can't be overappreciated is the radical logistical accomplishment that many religions have, in the sense of every week at a similar time, they're able to gather a large number of people who otherwise may never meet to carry out a program and see one another. And one of the things that I think is missed sometimes in the meaning conversation is that very nitty-gritty logistical reality. Because a lot of people with the meaning question will focus on worldview and does God exist or not, and that's all important. But it is so freaking hard as an adult just to arrange something, especially if you have kids and work. And like Robert Putnam, who I think is, I just think there's so many sociologists that are at the center of this question that you're working on, as you know, and that you've talked about. And the very fact, as you get older and you're just working in 9 to 5, not only do you have the existential aloneness, but then you have the burden of the logistics that you would have to carry out in order to arrange community. And so then you say, well, I'll just go to church because it's set up 9 to 5. They have a building, they have schedules. It's all quite there. I think what catches a lot of young people off guard, I think, who go to college, where so many of the logistical problems are taken care of. You walk down the sidewalk, you're probably going to bump into people, where food is, library, all of these different things. Then when you leave college, that hyper reality, to use Baudrillard's language, is gone, and all those logistical things have to be taken care of. And so then not only are you tired from work, but you're burdened by the lack of that logistical background. And then that also leads to the loneliness and different things like that. Please.
Right. And it's a very strong point, right? And even if you try and look outside of religion, right, what other institutions, right? I use that term very loosely. What other institutions are there, right? And unfortunately, probably the most prominent institution that some of the most prominent institutions that you can think of are these either localities of cultural power, or they're these broader spheres of cultural power, right? The localities are okay, well, most towns in America, right? Not only do they have a church, they have a bar, right? And it's okay, after work, what do you do if you want to hang out with your friends or find some place of community or some place of community on the weekends, right? You go to the bar, right? And I'm not saying necessarily that there's anything inherently wrong with religion or with bars or any of that, but there are concrete second order consequences that do happen based off of the approaches to community and the approaches to meaning that you take, right? There is a concrete, if you point out to statistics of like, why are there increasing deaths under alcoholism, right? Why are there increasing rates of alcoholism? You can't be, wave your hands away at these realities that do exist, right? And you talk about even things of like deaths of despair, right? So that doesn't just include suicide. Deaths of despair also includes overdoses. It also includes deaths by like alcohol poisoning, right? Driving under the influence, right? So I think those are very, pervasive elements that we oftentimes forget about, right? And then if you zoom out, like, okay, what are broader cultural elements where people can find community, right, outside of church? And it starts to look like, okay, you go to a concert or you go to a music festival or a sports event, right? And lots of these things, at least, the music festivals and the concerts are aimed at younger people, right? It's harder, again, to do that once you are looking at someone who has maybe 2 or 3 kids, lives in the suburbs, and has a job, right? And within the kids element, then what becomes a sense of community becomes things like parent-teacher associations, right? Kids' birthday parties, oftentimes the idea is that like it's not really for the kids, it's more so for the parents to find a sense of community, right? To find a sense of like shared belonging with other parents who have similarities in their lives, right? And the counterfact of this, and I alluded to this with like the bar analogy, is that whatever decision you decide to make as this resource of like how are you finding meaning in your life, there's second order effects of what happens to that, right, eventually. So if your main source of meaning is coming from my children, right, my children bring me a sense of legacy, community, I can kind of live vicariously through them, eventually your kids are going to want to individuate on their own. They're going to want to have their own journeys and their own experiences, right? And I think oftentimes parents experience this phenomenon of empty nester syndrome, which is, in kind of my opinion, another type of existential crisis. Your main source of meaning is evaporating or has evaporated, right? And this coincides oftentimes with the like a midlife crisis, like,
Absolutely.
okay, well, my kids don't need me anymore, right? This element of like having a sense of purpose is slowly receding and fading away. Not only do your kids not need you anymore, the logistical outlines that provided, to your point, are also fading and receding, right? You don't need to go to parent-teacher nights anymore. You don't need to go to your kids' piano recitals anymore. So a big interesting question, which I appreciate you bringing up, and I think is often, to your point, forgotten in this conversation, is that how do you create new, or plausibly, how do you reorient existing avenues of community, or create new avenues of community, and along with that, ritual and pattern, right? That people can find a sense of meaning in, that isn't conformist in the way that it's conformist and limiting to like only placating their fears. But how do you do that so it's actually encouraging them to fulfill their best possibilities, right? To actually be something that gives them a higher sense of purpose and meaning and fulfillment that transcends, these limitations of like, okay, well, this maybe causes liver disease and cirrhosis, and that causes, a midlife crisis of some sorts, right?
Everything you said is so important. No, I really like everything you said about going to the school, the dancing and different things. And like one of the issues now is that if people get social capital, it's not so readily the whole family together. Like when you go to church, the whole family goes. Well, the male could go to the bar. It's like very divided, and you only have so much time after work. And so if social capital is created, it's individualistic, it can be, which we may not even realize is a problem if our understanding of meaning is individualistic. But if we understand that no, social capital Well, let's put it this way. That might be one of the reasons you start seeing like falling birth rates in many first world nations. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but the Malcolm and Simone talk about that. And the research shows that people have less and less kids. Now, obviously, there's economic realities and there's work realities, but it's also interesting to think that if there are not available to people social ways to build capital, which then helps you gain the recognition and being a regular at the bar or the diner, then that in of itself can work against the formations of families. And then if family is a place where people find belonging and meaning, that's another issue. Now, that's an entire can of worms that would have to be described. But it's interesting to think that increasingly manners by which people, if they build social capital, it's fragmented from an entire family unit. It could be more kind of individuated in different things. Not always. And I do wonder, and then you can respond to that. The other thing I want to say before I forget, it would be another entire subject. So we'll have to talk again, because I know we're coming up on the close here, and I really have enjoyed this. If Lacan and a lot of the psychoanalytical thinkers or Zizek and all these other people are correct, that the subject is constituted by an essential lack, like there's a structural element to the psyche that can never be its own complete foundation, then that means individual efforts of meaning making are always going to be limited. They're not meaningless. They don't have a role, but they are always going to ultimately have to be situated in a community. And one of the things that people forget about Nietzsche is at the end of Zarathustra, the whole thing is ultimately about friendship and community. And one of the things I'd be curious, I do wonder if this middle zone between mass movement and isolationism has something to do with regaining the art of friendship. I bring that up as well because I really like Ivan Illich, and we're teaching a course at Parallax on Ivan Illich. And he said, like, basically, the modern world is in so much trouble because the loss of friendship. And that doesn't mean people don't have friends. We're not saying that, but like we don't have social practices that cultivate friendship other than just kind of random associates that you have that may or may not be friends. And I'm curious, is there anything in the research or that you've come upon that links this question with friendship? That's not supposed to be loaded if it sounds like a loaded question, but I wonder how much, if there's something with friendship that comes to bear on this question.
Right. And, Nietzsche has some wonderful things he says about friendship, and as corny as it may sound, the power of friendship, right? And it is a real thing, right? And I think there's a few different elements that I find interesting about this, right? Like what does friendship even constitute, and what does it mean, right? Like you could have different dimensions of friendships. You could have someone that, two people who know each other for years and years, and yet they don't really know anything about one another beyond the surface level formalities, right? Even though they might spend loads of time with one another, but they might have never gone past that, right? And then you could have someone, two people who spent only an afternoon together, right? And the depth of kind of like their friendship and their relationship has kind of transcended this kind of surface that doesn't oftentimes get transcended, right? So I think knowledge of one another is one element of friendship, and then there's other elements too, right? There's this element of like reliability. So in the former example, right, even though the two people perhaps don't have a high degree of depth, they maybe do have a high degree of reliability of one another, that, hey, this is, someone I can count on and rely on, and both those things have their value, right? Because in the latter instance, you might just have many loose associations that you very intimate details about, but you can't really quite rely on anyone. Now, how do you? I think you're also correct on like, hey, this has a huge bearing on the relationship of meaning, right? And this idea also of like the different layers of meaning, right? Meaning in something larger and greater than yourself, meaning of at this level of like, okay, you're who amongst your friends or family, what relationships here are meaningful, and then this element of like, okay, how do you kind of go within yourself and find what is meaningful to you as an individual? And all these layers are incredibly complicated, and so if kind of tying it into a little bit of kind of the work we're doing at the Net Project and the ideas that we're kind of thinking about, if you could start with a kind of a cliche philosopher's quote of Socrates saying something along the lines of like, the unexamined life is not worth living, or know thyself. And it doesn't even have to be as extreme as Socrates says it is, but this idea of like, okay, if you can examine your life and if you can kind of know yourself, that really is kind of the only way in which you can at least intentionally set yourself up for success in these ways, right? You can kind of, by dumb luck, wander into friendships that feel incredibly meaningful to you, right? And relationships that feel incredibly meaningful to you, right? Or a cause that feels incredibly meaningful to you, right? But when you leave those things up to dumb luck, you have the things that you're kind of talking about, where these crises are starting to happen at a systematic level, right? And if you leave it up to dumb luck, then your systems might, if they're agnostic of that, they might actually be opposed to that. And so this kind of gets into like, okay, what are we doing at the Net Project? And it's some element of this is like, okay, how do you show people like these things matter, so that they can intentionally seek it out, right? Rather than just relying on dumb luck, right? And maybe if you have enough people intentionally seeking it out, then it just becomes kind of like dumb luck by virtue of this being the system that we do exist in, right? So a big part of it is going to, like, so for those who are listening and aren't aware, netproject.org, we're a nonprofit, and I spoke at the beginning of what we're trying to help people think about meaning in healthier ways. And our main kind of like preliminary avenue of how we're trying to accomplish this is through a tech platform, or through a digital online platform. And we're drawing on lots of different schools of psychotherapy and psychology and philosophy, lots of which I've kind of talked about in this conversation today. But a big element is like, okay, we want people to be able to actually think about concretely, how does the way that they think about meaning, how do their beliefs affect their well-being, right? And for that, there is some work, unfortunately, on the part of the individual that they have to kind of take in and actually introspect and think about these things, right? And hopefully what we can try and do from our end is make that process easier and more accessible and more fun and engaging for the average person who's maybe very busy and who perhaps has a touch of avoidance because these topics are difficult and challenging to think about. And with the hope and the idea with that is that, okay, if you have people intentionally seeking out and creating, not only relationships, but broader decisions that encompass not just relationships, but friendships and, like what work they decide to do and how they decide to treat other people, and the trade-offs that they do decide to make and what their hobbies are, creating a culture of fulfillment and meaning rather than the path of least resistance, which has led to lots of the mass suffering that currently pervades our society, right? That's another question I oftentimes get asked. It's like, oh, shouldn't you just let people do whatever it is that they want to do? And my response is often like, sure, I don't have any problem letting people do what they want to do, but our culture has created such a place where like people doing whatever they want to do has led to many of these systematic issues that you also complain about, so you can't have it both ways.
I think that was all such a great answer. And as your project develops and as the work goes forward, you're invited here anytime to speak about it and anything that we can do. I'm going to have to send people interested in Ivan Illich that we work with your way, because this is exactly what I think is needed. And what you just said right there, I think there a way to think, I'm good friends and I love him, Owen. And he talks all the time. So first off, something he'll say is we always have to remember when Socrates says, know thyself, it is not merely intellectual, it's a kind of trial. It's a kind of social trial where you put yourself through certain situations and then see if you can rise to the occasion. That requires logos, but we always have to remember that classically it was the tripart soul. And the three parts of it generally are logos, eros, and thymos. And you have to have all three. If you don't have all three, you're not going to have this meaning in this deeper way. And you see what's happened is Francis Fukuyama at the end of history, and this has been the thesis of the, you could say, the neoliberal is a difficult word because it means a lot of things to a lot of people, but the Washington consensus world was the idea that we could address thymos, which is the need for recognition. And the thymos, there's a lot more to thymos, but a big part of it is this kind of recognition. We could address it through eros, either kind of pleasure or consume, or eros is also just do whatever you want to do, or we could intellectualize ourselves out of it through logos. I think neither of those strategies don't work. They don't work. We tried them. This is not, it's, you could even, it's been tried. It doesn't work because there is something about the human being that requires friendship. And that would be addressing things like thymos, but it's deeper than merely association. It has some sort of like, your friends often are the people that overcame something with you or were there for you in the hard time, or whoever they took on a complicated project or idea. There's some kind of deeper roots there that are thymotic. And I don't think we can deal with this problem of meaning unless we think that. And that's where, but then what you said, which I really, really appreciate, and then I'll give it to you for closing thoughts. And also everyone should know that Ali has been very kind. We have a yellow jacket infestation that we are trying to deal with, and I have some appointments to deal with, and Ali has been very kind to work with me on that. And disappointedly, though, I haven't been swarmed by yellow jackets. It would have been great for the video. It would have been a lot of fun, been a lot of meaning from that, I suppose, or story, been a good story. But before I give it to you for closing remarks, I really, really like what you said about dumb luck, because it's quite clear that you might have dumb luck and have friends. You might have dumb luck and be motivated. You might have dumb luck and end up as a Nietzschean child. And it's very, very clear that that has happened. I think we're at an age where we have to move beyond dumb luck. Like, the stakes are high. It's systematic. So we have to figure out what are the conditions that make these things like friendship in this deeper way possible, that make meaning in this deeper way possible without being oppressive. That's always the trick. Like, the moment you talking about scaling something, how do you do it without then being like oppressive? I call this, this for me is the problem of scale, like scaling something without being totalitarian, being intentional about something without being forceful. This is major. And I really just appreciate how you worded that, how you're aware of that, and how you're going about thinking about this. So if I were to throw it back to you on closing remarks, which can be about absolutely anything, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate that, and I appreciate your work, and I've appreciated this conversation, and it's really been a treat, Ali.
Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation, and likewise, I've enjoyed all that you've had to share with me, Daniel, and all your wonderful questions and your thoughts and your insights. I think I can close, connecting back what kind of you said at the end there, right? Where, how do you have these things manifest in a way where meaning and friendship and kind of a sense of community and belonging, fulfillment, purpose, how do you have all these, like good things manifest in a way that's not totalitarian, it's not fascist, right? And I think the answer to that is, yes, you ideally want it to be organic, right? But like nothing's ever truly completely organic, right? Like, there's certain elements that are still being input into the system, whether it's one way or another, right? So I think the answer to that, though, is you can try, and what we're doing at the netproject.org is we're trying to work on these problems in a bottom up kind of way, right? Where yes, we're research informed, and we're looking at the research and the literature and the theory and all of that, right? But kind of our theory of change isn't focused on like, hey, let's go to institutions, let's go to like broad like places of power, and let's try to make change that way. We're trying to make change at okay, like how do we reach people in a way that they can be reached, in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming, right? In a way that they don't need to pay $100, $200 to see someone to like once a week for 30 minutes to like deal with these issues, right? And sometimes their issues might not even get addressed if they're these deeper existential issues. And in line with kind of this like, bottoms up approach, it's not just kind of the implementation, but even our research and our thought process for how we go about it is oftentimes very informed by a bottoms up approach, in conjunction with this kind of like literature and research approach as well. Oftentimes, a big part of my research before, as I was writing my thesis and before I was writing my thesis was I was kind of going out and asking people how they were thinking about meaning and how they were interacting with some of my ideas. And we still do a lot of that as we're working on our ideas. We don't just kind of take the literature and take our own thoughts about it, and we're like, okay, this is it, we're done. We kind of like think about it and see how we can use these ideas in a way, like, are these ideas relevant in helping people? And if so, like, how can we use them to help other people? Then we kind of ask people, like, do you find, like, is the way we're thinking about this, is this kind of resonant with you? Is this something that kind of like would have helped you at times, right? So that's kind of, like how we think about things at project.org, and how we're hoping to continue thinking about things.
I love that response. I think that's exactly the way to go about it. And I really appreciate how you shared that. And I really appreciate the work that you're putting in to make that possible, because I think it's necessary. I think this is essential work, extremely essential work. And it's work that's hard to do because you have to see the problem and really do a lot of work to get a capture on what's going on, so that you, for example, if you misunderstand meaning, in my opinion, as merely being individual, like it's only individual, then you may go about starting a business and doing a bunch of things that don't necessarily help the problem. And that's just reality. If you don't know where we are, if you don't know where we are, you don't know where we need to go. And so it takes a lot of work. You have to write a thesis to get a frame of the problem, let alone then try to implement a business, a project, an initiative to do something about it. There are 2 steps there, both of which are difficult, and I applaud you for taking both of them and continuing to work on it. So well done to you, sir. It's been a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. Really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it.